I'll tell you a quick funny story. I walked into the men's room and I'd not met the real Don Steele yet, because why would he show up at the meeting in the morning to meet me? He doesn't have to be on till 2:00. And so I walk into the men's room and Steele is standing at a urinal, and I walk up to a urinal and he says, "Hey, you must be the new guy." And I go, "Yeah, I'm Mike McVay." And he does a joke about, "Don't mind if I don't shake your hand." And I hit the flusher on the urinal and it squirts water out onto my chest. And I go jumping backwards and Steele says, "Welcome to the big time, kid."
Benztown President Dave Chachi Dennis loves radio and all of his radio friends.
Hey, Chachi.
Hey, everybody.
Because Chachi loves everybody.
Our next guest has had a remarkable career in the radio industry with expertise spanning content creation, broadcasting, network syndication, talent coaching, artist development, and media strategy design. He served as the Executive Vice President of Content and Programming for Cumulus Media and Westwood One Radio Network from 2011 to 2019. His career also includes roles as a station owner, a market manager, operations manager, program director, and air talent in various markets. Among his many achievements, he co-created the nationally syndicated radio show Delilah and developed programs with Donny Osmond, John Sally, Jim Brickman, Doug Stefan, and Mark McGrath. He continues to consult the John Test Show and other syndicated programs. An international media consultant, he was a founding partner in Futuri, an investor in Edison Research, and is actively involved in Benztown. His high-level coaching clients include Stephen A. Smith, Soledad O'Brien, and Gene Chatsky. He's a recipient of the prestigious Broadcasting Foundation of American Leadership Award, the Conclave's Rockwell Award. He was named Corporate Programmer Consultant of the Year 4 times and was given a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Worldwide Radio Summit in 2020. He's been recognized 3 times as a Broadcast Executive of the Year by Radio and Records, and this fall he's going to receive the Giants of Broadcasting and Electronic Arts Award from the Library of American Broadcasting Foundation. Please welcome the president of McVay Media, Mike McVay.
Thank you. I don't know if I can live up to those accolades, but thank you.
That is one heck of a bio, my friend. That might be the most robust bio I've read. Incredibly impressive career.
Thank you. I think it just means that I've been around a long time.
Well, you don't look like it. You look fantastic. Tell me a little bit about wanting to be in radio and knowing that's what you wanted to do when you were just 10 years old.
Yeah, I have a really strange, I grew up a blue-collar kid outside of Pittsburgh, southwestern Pennsylvania. My father was a railroader. He was an engineer on the Pennsylvania Railroad. My grandfather was an engineer before him. And because my parents worked on the railroad, we could ride trains for free. The little train station in my little community area, Greensburg, PA, was right next to a radio station. And so my brother and I used to jump on a train. I was 10. He was 7 years older than me, so he was 17. And we would take the train into Pittsburgh and run around for the day. So think about that for a second, Chachi. No cell phones. You got a 10-year-old and a 17-year-old. You let them take a 45-minute train ride into a city like Pittsburgh and run around. My mother's only rule was be home before dark.
A very different world. The fact that you could do that and not worry about any sort of anything evil happening to you is quite incredible.
So I stood outside that radio station as we would wait for the train, and I watched Cowboy Phil on WHJB radio play records, studio window. While the records were on, Phil would occasionally get up and walk in a back room and then come back out. And I said to my older brother, Jim, "What do you think he does while the records are on?" And he said, "Oh, they smoke and play cards in the back." And I decided I wanted to go into radio. That's what led me into radio.
You were in.
I was in.
Were your parents supportive of it?
Yeah, they were pretty much. I wanted to be a Lutheran minister. And my mother was so excited about that when I quit school early, I didn't finish college. I didn't really go to college. I just kind of showed up for a little while. And when I decided I was going to leave and do radio full time, she was disappointed then, but they got over it.
And what was the deciding factor? Because very different careers. What made you decide that being a Lutheran minister wasn't the right career choice for you?
I mean, radio was really my passion. As a young kid, probably about 15, I started thinking I wanted to be a minister. And, it just kind of steamrolls then, right? The snowballs started down the hill. My parents, everybody thought it was so great. And I should have cut it off sooner, but I just kept thinking I would let everybody down if I didn't do it. Now, my joke that I will tell you is that I say to people, being a minister has a lot of rules. For there's 10 commandments to begin with.
Right.
And so I joke and say it was just too much. But the reality of it wasn't what I really wanted to do. And it was a young minister at the school that said to me, you got to be really, really committed to this. And it just kind of talked me out of wanting to do it.
And radio obviously was the right choice for you because you've had such a remarkable career, which we're going to get into right now. Starting with working at several Pittsburgh radio stations, you got your first gig at 15. And what was your day-to-day at 15 years old?
So that was WHJB in Greensburg, that station I used to look through the window at. They had an AM, an FM that was called WOKU, and then they had cable television, WHJB cable TV. So I would do a weekend show on the radio and do stuff after school at the cable TV station. And so in those days, cable television had to have X number of hours a week in community programming. So back to me wanting to be a minister, I'm 15 years old. The Vietnam War was going on. Young people were protesting. Woodstock was happening. And so the cable television station started a show called What's Happening with Youth. And I was one of the 3 panelists on this weekly show. A minister named Dr. Kenneth Rutter had myself and 2 other youth on that program every week. And we would talk about, abortion was a big issue back then, conscientious objection, things were going on with kids. And so it was just a community affairs program like that. That sucked me into radio.
I mean, those were current events and things that were obviously, happening with the culture in general. And so were you a studious student, or were you more of an artistic person? How did you kind of fall?
I was really kind of both. I mean, I was studious around those things I liked. So my journalism class I did well in, English lit history, math was a disaster, science was a disaster. And so the things that I liked, I did well in. The other things, if I got a C, I was like, woot, woot. But, public speaking, when I got to high school and started taking those classes, that really was my thing. That got me.
You're going to school, you're working at a few different stations in Pittsburgh, working on this community affairs program. And then in 1974, I assume after you've graduated, you make the move and you now follow this career like so many of us have to a different town, a different state, and you move to West Virginia to take a program director role. What was that like, moving away from your family, who you're obviously very close to, and really now no longer doing this as a student, but this is your career?
Leaving the household and my parents was a little tough. My mother is great at guilt. And so there was that, but it was great for me. I always say to people I started in Wheeling, West Virginia, but it was really a radio station in Moundsville, West Virginia, right next to Wheeling. The guy who was the general manager was a guy named Randy Chamberlain. He had been the program director. He had been an air talent in Wheeling of some notoriety. And Randy really taught me radio. He was really very good in taking a chance on a kid to have that first real PD job. And I did mornings and I made mistakes and he coached me.
Outside of the smoking and the cards, were you more attracted to being on the air or being a program director? Because your first couple gigs, you were doing both.
If I was really good as an air talent, that's what I would have pursued. I was just okay. To me, the center of all creativity is being an on-air talent on a morning show. It doesn't matter how many billboards you have, how much money you're giving away, how many TV commercials you're running to promote your show. If it doesn't happen when your ass hits the chair and you turn on the mic, it's not going to happen. And that's what I really love, was being on the air. But as you can hear, I've had voice problems over the years. I was never as smart or as good as the really good guys. I was on the air in LA. I was on the air in bigger markets. But I just found that the programming was a great substitute for being on air. And I really wanted to control my destiny. And so as a program director, I could do that more so than as an air talent. And that's what led to being a market manager and a consultant, was about controlling my destiny.
What air talent and what programmers were you looking up to when you were getting your career started?
Ed Salomon, probably my greatest mentor, because he was in nearby Pittsburgh, and he reached out to me about programming, not a PD, but being on air and helping him out as an overnight person. I didn't take it, but through that we started a long-term relationship. I would say that, it was more about, because I became a PD myself so young, it was not really about PDs I worked for. But Bob Pittman, who's my age, was a program director in Pittsburgh at WPEZ. I could listen to his station and learn. A guy named John Rook had a top 40 AM in Pittsburgh called 13Q that was competing with Bob Pittman's station. And so I could listen to that station and learn. So I would say it was about listening and learning more so than working for a PD, other than Ed Salomon, who I worked for later in my career.
In 76, you get a job now in Charleston. You are program director in morning talent. What made you, bigger market, you were trying to grow. What was the reason for that change?
In those days, you'd move for an extra $100 or two a month. And so I think I made about an extra $100 a week in Charleston. I got to be a program director, morning talent on WCHS, which was a big full service news talk station that still played some music. And they had a TV station. And so I got to do some things on the TV station too. It was about growing to a bigger market, wheeling to Charleston. And I figured from Charleston, maybe I go to Columbus, Ohio next, or Cleveland, and someday get back to Pittsburgh. That was kind of my ideas in moving to bigger markets.
I see. Bring it full circle back to your hometown.
Right.
Instead, you get tapped to come to the West Coast here in LA, and you're hired as the assistant national PD for Store Radio. That's a gigantic jump. How did that opportunity come to be?
So Ed Salomon, who I'd mentioned earlier, had, talked to me about that job in Pittsburgh at WHJB, and I didn't take it, and I went to Charleston. And by then, he was a corporate program director and also programming WHN in New York City for Store. And he reached out to me and kind of said, you passed on Pittsburgh, but you went to Charleston. And we talked about what my career goals were and what I wanted to do. He talked to me briefly about a job in Miami at a sister station of theirs, WGBS. And I just didn't feel good about that situation. And he called me one night, probably about 10 o'clock, because he was in LA. Now, if you're a morning person, that means you're asleep for 2 hours already. and I remember him waking me up and being confused, and him saying to me, you know what? Go splash some water on your face and I'll call you back in 10 minutes. And so he called me back and said, okay, I'm going to hire an assistant national PD to be my West Coast guy. He had already hired my best friend in the world, Charlie Cook, to be his assistant national PD in the East Coast. And Charlie was at WHN with him. And he said, this is the last job I'm going to offer you. Are you interested in this? And I was like, absolutely. And so they flew me to Los Angeles. Now, I will tell you, that job interview was only the second time in my life I'd flown anywhere.
No kidding.
And I was such a rube. To get from Charleston to LA, you had to change planes in Houston. So I checked my bag from Charleston to Houston, went and got it, went out and checked it again to get to LA. I didn't know you could check your bag the whole way through. Of course, they didn't have security then, so you just, ran downstairs, got your bag again, checked it, and ran back to your gate. It was when I was going from LA back to Charleston that the woman at the gate said to me, "No, we can check your bag all the way through."
You land in Los Angeles. You're 24 years old. The biggest market you've worked in, I mean, you worked in Pittsburgh, with some very varying positions, but in terms of management, I mean, this is a significant jump.
Truly.
What were you feeling? Is there anxiety, confidence?
I would say I was anxious. Keep in mind, 10Q had been this legendary station launched by probably one of the people you used to listen to, Jimmy Fox, when he was in San Diego. And he had built this radio station that had, before I got there, Rich Brother Robin and people like that were on it. When I got there, Jack Armstrong, who I'd listened to in Pittsburgh, was the morning talent. The real Don Steele was doing afternoons. Machine Gun Kelly, not the rapper artist.
Yeah, sure.
But the original air talent, was doing nights. I mean, Nancy Plum overnight, Joe Nasty, Dave Sebastian, amazing talent. Don Steele left while I was there, and Ed moved Jack Armstrong to afternoons and hired Charlie Tuna. And so it started before I ever got there, my anxiety. Because at my goodbye party in Charleston, they gave me a T-shirt that read, "I must hurry to catch up with the others, for I am their leader."
That's a great shirt.
And it was very appropriate. But the air talent there was so good. Ed was such a great mentor and was very patient with me. And I felt like I worked for those air talent, which, by the way, if you're a great PD and you have great talent, you should be working for them because your success is dependent on them.
That talent is just an amazing list of talent, all-star talent. Was it difficult to manage that, or were they respectful, or were they like, "Who's this kid?"
Well, I think when I first showed up, they were kind of like, "Who's this kid?" I'll tell you a quick funny story. I walked into the men's room and I'd not met the real Don Steele yet, because why would he show up at the meeting in the morning to meet me? He doesn't have to be on till 2:00. And so I walk into the men's room and Steele is standing at a urinal, and I walk up to a urinal and he says, "Hey, you must be the new guy." And I go, "Yeah, I'm Mike McVay." And he does a joke about, "Don't mind if I don't shake your hand." And I hit the flusher on the urinal and it squirts water out onto my chest. And I go jumping backwards and Steele says, "Welcome to the big time, kid." That was my Don Steele moment. But, in teaching and working and coaching, it was intimidating at first to sit down with a Charlie Tuna or Jack Armstrong or Machine Gun Kelly. The three of them were very different. Armstrong knew that I was a groupie, and because I had just gushed over him when I first met him, and he therefore was sympathetic. He knew I was a fan, and so he was sympathetic. Tuna was absolutely amazing in that he wanted the comments and suggestions. I know you've worked with Charlie. Charlie wanted to hear from me what I thought. His shift was 6 to 10. He insisted on going on the air at 5 because he said he needed that first hour to warm up. And so if I said something to him in a coaching manner and it wasn't something he felt comfortable about, he said to me, that's not who I am. Here's how I would do that. And because it was a conversation, it was collaborative, I feel we always ended up where we needed to be. MG Kelly, who became a longtime friend and is still a friend, was probably the most dismissive, because he had been in movies. He was in Dirty Harry. He was in Star is Born. He would get invited to parties that Barbra Streisand was throwing. But, we got along well because what I figured out was with him, I had to be more forceful and I had to draw lines in the sand, and he wouldn't cross them if there was a line in the sand. And we ended up working at a couple stations. When I was consulting, I hired him in a couple different markets later, just because he's such an amazing talent.
What was your day-to-day? You're the assistant national PD, but you're for the entire West Coast. So are you traveling too and overseeing some other stations, or really just focused here in LA?
Really focused on LA, and then whatever Ed needed. If Ed needed something for the Milwaukee TV stations, while he wasn't over television programming, If there was something they were doing that needed music or something, and I could help, that was it. But it was really being Ed's assistant, so Ed could go back and forth. And how I became the PD itself, because when I first got there, I wasn't the program director. I was Ed's assistant PD based there. And so the program director departed and went to another station in LA. And Ed said to me, hey, you have to become the PD of the radio station. You have to become the PD of the radio station. Out of everything that could be negative, there was a real positive. The could be negative was that Ed knew, but I did not yet know, that Store was going to sell all of its radio stations to put all their money into something new, cable TV, that was starting to grow. And because 10Q, where I was going to be sold to a group to go Spanish, and the station is still Spanish today, it was a great opportunity for me. I'm convinced if they were going to continue to operate it, they would have hired someone with programming experience that deserved, that it earned to be in LA. But because I was there and they were selling it, I had the chance to learn.
Yeah, he really did you a solid. He was a good friend and gave you that opportunity, got your PD stripes in Los Angeles. And to work with that talent, I mean, that experience in and of itself had to have been very rewarding, but also very educational.
Totally. I learned so many things from working with those talent. And like I say, I felt like I worked for them because it was all about making things great. And we did so many creative things. I mean, we had guest DJs at night. So Gene Simmons from Kiss would come in, and from 11 to midnight, he would play whatever he wanted. We didn't feel it could hurt us 11 p.m. at night, and it gave us the chance to say, former 10Q guest DJ Gene Simmons in Kiss, whenever we played a Kiss song.
I've seen some of the pictures. One stands out where you're in a picture. I think Brooke Shields is in the shot and somebody else. It appears you were living the LA lifestyle. You were enjoying the parties and the glamour and really making the most of your time here. What was that like during the 70s and, LA and Hollywood and being part of this massive radio station?
I mean, I was at a lot of things, but the pictures actually paint a more partying lifestyle that I wish I would have taken advantage of. I went to the things that were station things that we threw. That was another of Ed's ideas was to throw birthday parties for celebrities like Gene Simmons, like Stephen Bishop.
In that picture, I'm sorry, it's Gene Simmons and Brooke Shields, right?
Yeah, Brooke Shields. Yep.
Yes. Yeah.
Brooke Shields was there because it was Gene Simmons' birthday party. She was not invited as a celebrity. She stood in line like everybody else to get up to meet him. And when she got up there, all the cameras just started poof, poof, poof. But I didn't really, if I could do it over, Chachi, I would take advantage of more things. But it was a job that I wanted to excel at. And my wife was pregnant with our first child. We'd only been married about a year. And so I had family that I was juggling here on one side and the job on another side. So don't get me wrong, I was out 2 or 3 nights a week. But if I knew then what I know now, I'd be out 6 nights a week.
Actually, probably in hindsight, it was the right thing to do, to be more conservative. I look back at even the era that I was in and just kind of the crazy things that happened in this city. And I imagine that there was a multiple put on that back when you were here. And to not indulge in that probably took a lot of discipline, but it could have ended up on the wrong side of it if you overindulged. I respect that, and I think you are where you are today probably because you didn't. I know other programmers and other people that unfortunately this city is chewed up and spit out before.
Yeah.
So the station sells. Are you kind of heartbroken at that point? I mean, you knew it was coming, obviously, but now you've got to make a choice and find a gig somewhere else.
Yeah, and so I left maybe 4 months before the deal closed, or 5 months, and they had done a retention bonus for all of us if we stayed the whole way through. And I can't remember if it was 6 months' pay or what it was if we stayed, but I had started to look around, and there was a legendary consultant named George Burns, not the comedian with the cigar, but a radio consultant named George Burns who lived in L.A., and I had met him a couple times while I was out there. And I had made him aware that, this place is going to sell. I'm going to need a job. I've now got a baby. And George was consulting WAKY in Louisville, Kentucky, which had been a top 40 station on AM. And those stations were starting to move to FM or go more classic hits, oldies, if you will. And so I made him aware I was looking, and he reached out to me. I flew into Louisville for a job. They offered me the same money I was making in LA, plus a car on trade. And, even back in the late 70s, LA was expensive compared to the rest of the world. The market manager in Louisville, George Francis, was brilliant, great salesman. Because he brings me in the first night we have dinner, we get to know each other. The next day, he shows me the station. We sit and talk. He's telling me what the money is, they'll give me a car, they'll give me a gasoline credit card. And he'd lined up a real estate agent. He says, I know you haven't made a decision yet, but I want you to see what you can get for your money here. And my wife and I had basically a 3-room, not 3-bedroom, 3-room apartment on Cochrane in LA, not far from the Miracle Mile. He shows me a 3-bedroom townhome in Louisville that was half of what we're paying in LA. And the real estate agent says what the monthly rent is there. And you have a first and last month. And when she says the number, I repeat it because I can't believe that I heard what I heard. She thinks I'm saying it because it's expensive. And she goes, I know it's expensive, but it's well worth it. And before I can say anything, George says, and if you take this job, we'll pick up your first and last month's deposits.
I'm in.
And so he drops me off at the airport to fly back to LA. I say to him, look, I got to talk this over with my wife. I get to LA that evening because of the flights. And he sent my wife roses, encouraging her to get closer to home because she's from Southern Ohio.
Classy move. Really, really bright. You moved to Louisville. And by the way, the first time I was ever in Kentucky was with you a couple years ago. What a beautiful state. Yeah, beautiful place. Absolutely beautiful place. You were there for a couple years as the PD and the OM. I assume good time and a beautiful place to live. And then you get offered a position to go to WWE, Cleveland, to become the station manager. And so you've been now a programmer, you've been on the air, you've been an OM, but station manager is a whole other role. And, you've got sales that you're also now in charge of. What was that transition like?
Well, I really enjoyed Louisville. And your point about how beautiful Kentucky is, Doris and I always say we could have lived in Louisville the rest of our lives and been happy because it was just a great place. But George Francis had left that station, the guy who was my manager there, and went to Cleveland to become the market manager at 3WE and a beautiful music station called WDOK. George knew that I wanted to become a manager. When I was in Louisville, at one point, because I was telling him I wanted to learn sales, he actually invited me to the sales meetings and gave me a couple clients that were mine so I could learn some sales. And so he said to me, look, Gannett owns these stations. Gannett then owned KISS in LA and Chicago and, a bunch of big markets.
USA Today.
Yeah, USA Today, TV stations everywhere. And he said to me, come in here, you be the station manager, you'll be involved in sales. I leave here, you could become the GM. So when I get there, I was there maybe 6 months, and it just wasn't going to happen. I mean, I could tell that I really was an ops manager, not a station manager. We did flip the easy listening FM to AC, so that was good. WDOK, which is still in AC today, but it just didn't feel like I had a shot. George gets sent to San Diego, and they promoted a guy who's a friend of mine also, Tom Wilson. They promoted the director of sales to be the market manager. And so at that point I went, I'm just not going to get this gig. When I was leaving Louisville to go to 3WE, a legendary owner, Bernie Dittman in Mobile, Alabama, used to call me for free advice. And when I was leaving, he called me and he said, why are you going up there? And I told him, because I want to learn to be a GM. And he said, I would have given you a GM job. So George leaves, I don't get it. So I called Bernie and said, hey, are you serious? Would you consider me for a market manager gig? And so he hired me to be his GM, and Doris and I moved to Mobile, Alabama for a year.
Shed some light on how you got as lucky as you did marrying Doris McVay and her being as open as she was to moving around the country, because she's now done about a half a dozen stops with you. Is she okay with this, or do you kind of have to talk her into it each time, or she's up for the adventure?
Now that there's grandkids, she would not be okay with it.
Okay.
But she doesn't want to not be near the grandkids. But no, she was all in. I mean, Doris is a smart one. She's got the degrees. Everywhere we were, in Wheeling when we met, she had got a degree in business management, but also became a nurse because she wanted something else to do. And we're still dating at that time. She doesn't like it. She gets a job in retail. She had a job with a manufacturing company in Charleston. In LA, she gets a job as an administrative assistant at an insurance company. In Cleveland, the first time we were there, it was Dan Howard Maternity Shops she's managing. She managed maternity shops in Louisville. In Mobile, she managed a Van Heusen shirt store. So she was retail management, and she got gigs right away wherever we were. And I married well, man. She's a powerful woman, and she banked on me. And I say to people all the time, a big part of McVay Media's success is that she and I launched it together. It wasn't me starting it, and she's the wife. She's always been our general manager. She's always been the admin.
I'm excited to get into McVay Media here. We got a couple more stops along the way, but the success you guys have and still continue to have with your consultancy is really just a phenomenal story. So I'm really excited to learn some more about it. You're in Mobile. You really are true. You're a station manager, but now you are a GM, and you've had this opportunity. Explain to me some of the nuances and the differences between being a program director and now the responsibilities that you've got as a GM. How are they similar, but also how are they greater?
I'm going to tell you why I think programmers make better market managers. As a programmer, you know how to read the ratings, you have a budget, you're involved in content, you understand the technical side and the engineering side. The only thing you don't have day-to-day hands-on is sales. That's it, right? You live the job. Sales is the only thing you don't have day-to-day hands-on. So when I got to Mobile, Bernie worked at teaching me sales and sales management. And, I was only there for a year, but when I ran into Bernie a year or two later at a conference, I said to him, I still have teeth marks in my ass from you teaching me, and I didn't always feel that you were teaching me, but when I went to the job after Mobile, I used to hear Bernie's voice in my head. Some situation would pop up, and I'd hear Bernie's voice saying, I wouldn't do that. You don't want to do that. I'm really blessed in the mentors I had and the people I worked with. Totally.
They're so important in helping, literally pave those trails for us and turn them into roads. And I agree. You being one of my mentors, there's no way I would be where I am today without them. So you in Mobile, and now you get an opportunity to become a GM in Cleveland. And so you go back to Cleveland as a GM. And this, by the way, is the last stop that you make before starting your consultancy, which we're going to get into here in just a moment. So tell me a bit about your second time around in Cleveland.
So I moved back to Cleveland in 82. So track the years. I went bing, bing, bing pretty quickly.
Yeah.
It was late 82 or mid 82. And there was a rock station called M105. It had been owned by two brothers, Jim Imbrescia and Tom Imbrescia. And they had an AM that was playing Music of Your Life, which for the listeners of this podcast who don't know, that's kind of a big band nostalgia format.
40s, yeah.
Yeah. And so Larry Robinson bought the radio station, M105 and WBBG, from the Imbrescia brothers. He hired the research group, which was a big research company back in the day. They did a study. The big AC in town was WGAR AM, and they said, you guys should do an oldies-based AC. Play music from the 60s, 70s, and today. And Larry was looking for a market manager. Again, George Francis' name pops up. George got a call from Larry asking him if he would consider moving from San Diego back to Cleveland. George was like, no, but he gave him my name and said, I know a guy who still owns a house there who would probably consider coming back. And so I flew in, interviewed with Tom Imbrescia, the former owner, who was at that time the manager. And that was part of it is Tom Imbrescia told him he would stay for 1 year. Well, it was coming up on that year. And so I interviewed, I got the job. Larry Robinson was an amazing person, another great mentor. His father owned J.B. Robinson Jewelers, which is about 72 stores through the Midwest. Larry sold it to W.R. Grayson Company for $40 million. Yes. Back when $1 million was worth a lot of money in the early 80s.
Back when $1 million was $1 million.
Yeah, exactly. That should be a song. Yeah. But so Larry, when I interviewed with him, I said, I'm impressed that you're talking to a content guy with some sales experience versus a sales guy. And he said, I used to be a teacher at Harvard before I came back to run my father's company. And he said, I've never understood why radio doesn't go to the content guys. And he rattled off businesses. The auto industry, Lee Iacocca designed cars. John
Z. DeLorean, who designed the GTO and then went on to, failing with the DeLorean, but it was an awesome car.
It was a great car, good in movies. But so that was who Larry was. And his joke was, he went away, he studied, he became a professor. He was running the MBA program at Harvard, and his father died. And he said, I moved back to Cleveland to liquidate my father's company, and I've been liquidating it ever since. He was just great. From him, and Chachi, because Benztown's a client, has seen my devotion to taking notes, to journaling, to coming up with plans of action. All that came from Larry Robinson. Larry taught me all of that.
Amazing. So he's a mentor, and this is kind of secondary, though, to him because he's operating these jewelry stores, and obviously he owned the radio station, but were you more of the expert in that field?
I would say yes, but also Tom Imbrescia, the guy who'd been his market manager. When Tom stepped away, he still consulted from a management standpoint, and Tom went on to buy other stations, but Larry gave me a big voice. We had all agreed on the name Magic. At one point, he wanted to change the name. We hadn't launched yet, and he wanted to change the name. And it was the first time Larry and I got into a shouting match. We respected each other, but we would shout at each other. And the guy took his watch off and threw it at me. And I just put it in my pocket and said, you know what, I'm out of here. And that argument took place in a room of about 6 people. And I got home, and there were no cell phones then. And I get home, and my wife has a tiny little notepad like you would put beside your phone to write down a number.
Right.
And she says, what happened? And I go, why? Larry Robinson called here and said, can I leave a note? And it used 12 pages or some big number of those little notes. And it was him saying, it was the first fight we had, and it was him saying, I appreciate your passion. I appreciate that you stood up for what you believe. We're going to do it your way. Never hesitate to argue with me. I always have the right to override you. And that was the bottom line. And you've probably heard me say that to people that I work with, where I'll say to them, and I say it to my clients, so I'll go, look, you're the client. I'm going to tell you what I believe. You can always say, no, Mike, we're moving on, and I'll move on. But Larry's point was you don't want to stifle the message and step in it.
I think that's a really good point. And I've been in meetings. I've never had a watch thrown at me, but I've had headphones thrown at me. I've had a cart thrown at me. There's been some very heated times, but I walked out of all of those experiences learning something. And it's honestly something I like about this business because we're all so passionate about it. And, whether the name of the station is Magic or Light, or does it really matter now? In retrospect, it doesn't. But that passion and to have that love for the industry and what's sonically going over the airs, I think is really exciting. And honestly, I miss that a little bit.
Oh, yeah.
You could never do that today. We would.
No.
HR would be involved immediately. But I'm kind of glad that we were in that era when those things happened, to be honest with you.
It definitely furthered my experience. And Larry had a guy who was president of his jewelry company named Larry Pollock, who was right under him in the jewelry company. And he pulled Larry Pollock into a lot of the meetings for management consultation and advice. And Pollock later went on to own radio stations with Tom and Brescia, who I'd mentioned. Pollock was another person I learned a lot from because he was a really stellar, even-keeled manager. And he later ran K Jewelers as their CEO.
Sure.
And so, that's exposure I wouldn't have had otherwise, right? Those guys were just fabulous because you had Robinson, who was very passionate, who would argue and we'd get into arguments. And Pollock, who sometimes, would say to me, we're going to have a signal. When you see me touch my nose, that means quiet down and I'll handle this.
The Library of American Broadcasting Foundation presents the Giants of Broadcasting and Electronic Arts Luncheon.
Join us on November 12th at Gotham Hall in New York City. This prestigious event will be emceed by Bill Whitaker of 60 Minutes and CBS News.
Honoring the 2024 LABF Giants of Broadcasting and Electronic Arts, Al Roker, Christine Baranski, Mike McVay, Patsy Smolin, Stephen A. Smith, Steve Jones, and Wendy McMahon.
Plus, Hearst Television receives the LABF Excellence in Broadcasting Preservation Award.
Proceeds benefit the preservation and expansion of the Library of American Broadcasting and the education initiatives of the Broadcast Education Association.
For event sponsorship and ticket information, visit tvradiolibrary.org. Be a part of preserving the past, reflecting the present, and informing the future. tvradiolibrary.org.
I want to dive into the next two chapters, which are by far the longest chapters of your career, and I think the part of your career that you're most known for. And it's been very nice to learn about the foundation and these stops that you made along the way to starting McVay Media. After you take the GM gig that you just talked about in Cleveland at MJI and BBG, you decide to launch along with Doris and then Charlie a year later, your dear friend Charlie Cook, McVay Media. That's a huge, gigantic step. Where did that idea come from, and why did you decide to go down that path as opposed to taking another, I'm sure, very high-profile program director gigs were offered to you at that point, GM gigs and so forth? What made you decide that I'm going to start my own business?
Well, I really, like I said earlier, I wanted to control my own destiny. And when Larry Robinson sold those radio stations, he sold them to Terry Jacobs, who is the original founder of J-Core, which I know a lot of people are aware of, that later merged into Clear Channel and so on. Terry Jacobs' first major market that he bought was Cleveland. Randy Michaels, who later would come along, was not yet part of his company. He owned in Parkersburg, West Virginia. He owned a little religious AM in Cincinnati, and then bought Cleveland. And so I was that next guy who could help show him programming and talk about what we needed to do. I had decided that I was going to be a consultant about a year earlier, and Larry Robinson was allowing me to consult 4 stations on the side. So I had a station in Tampa, Toledo, Roanoke, Virginia, Rochester, New York. Larry Robinson had bought KWK and KQOL in St. Louis. And so there was a market manager there, but I was over that market.
I see.
And Larry wanted me to go to St. Louis, by the way. He said, if Terry Jacobs doesn't keep you, go to St. Louis and run those stations. Our daughter, Nikki, had just started kindergarten. Doris was pregnant with our second child. Most wives who are pregnant would not say, have you thought about doing this full time? But Doris McVay did. We sat down and ran a pro forma. She said to me, here's the money you're making on these 4 stations. If Larry becomes a 5th client, how many clients do you think you need to cover what you make now? 12. So why don't you give them 90 days notice and get 12 clients? And so I did that. And Terry Jacobs, again, another great mentor. Terry didn't want me to leave. He said, part of why we're buying this station is the success you've had. What if I do this? What if I pay you what you make now to consult us, and you're here one day a week, you're here Mondays each week, and we hire a market manager who you work with and supervise for a year? That gave me a launching pad. I never missed a paycheck. I was able to launch. So you hear all these names that people may or may not know, but I've stood on a lot of other people's shoulders to get to where I am.
The first 4 clients that you had while you were still working as the GM, did those kind of come about organically?
The first one was Roanoke, Virginia. They had started calling me when I was at Wacky in Louisville to help them because it was a similar situation. The second one was Lou Dickey Sr.'s radio stations in Toledo, and Lou Sr. had been part owner in Wheeling, and so I knew him from there. Rochester was also Lou Sr.'s station. And then Milwaukee, Tom and Brescia, the man whose name I mentioned a couple times, had bought Milwaukee, and he had a market manager there whose name was John Pinch, who I'm sure will come up later in the story.
Of course. This is so fascinating because obviously I remember John and Lou from the Cumulus days, and it's making sense when we get to this other gigantic chapter of your career, and then of course John. So very fascinating. So they were all integral in the early part of your career and early clients.
Yes. Yeah, I'd met them all along the way, and then they became clients of mine, and we built from there. About a year in, we were at that point where I needed more help.
Unbelievable. So you hang up your shingle, and stations have seen what you've done, and obviously the stations that you've worked for, and then the stations you've started to consult for while you were still the GM, and business starts rolling. And now you get to a point where you need to hire someone. Do you know Charlie at this point, or do you put an ad out, or how does Charlie get involved?
Charlie Cook and I met in Wheeling, West Virginia. He was the PD of WWVA in Wheeling. He was doing mornings. I was mornings at the other station across the street. Charlie always goads me into saying, why don't you tell people about the ratings you had there, Mike? We had a fluke and we hit like a 23 share. And it was just for one book, we have a 23 share. And then Charlie always says, and what did I have? Well, you had a 30 share, Charlie. And so Charlie and I met in Wheeling. Charlie's known my wife almost as long as I have, and we became fast friends. He went off to work with Ed Salomon. I go off to work with Ed in L.A., but you circle back, and he was a PD in L.A., and we hired him to join us in McVay Media.
Incredible. Does he move to Cleveland?
No, he stayed in L.A. for the first year or two, but about the same time, there was a company that you'll remember called Fair West.
Of course, Reg Johns and George Johns.
Yep. The Fair West came from Fairbanks and West, Jim West. And so Jim West was the affiliate guy for George and Reg. George and Reg, who I have such great respect for, brilliant, creative people, they were the big AC consultants. And that was the format I was trying to win in. And so I had heard from someone that Jim West and Reg or George, one of them, were breaking up. And so I reached out to Jim West and said, come be my affiliate guy. Come do me. And so we struck a deal, and Jim came in and he took a big percentage of what he added, but it was worth it because he accelerated our growth. Charlie moved to Nashville because Jim said, look, he's your country guy. He needs to be in Nashville. And so we moved Charlie to Nashville.
And it now starts to take off like wildfire. I mean, in the peak, you are now consulting over 200 radio stations. You've got, and this is just a few of the consultants that have worked with you. Charlie, of course, Jay Albright, Bob Moody, Jerry King, Harv Blaine, Chris Elliott, Val Garris, Greg Gillespie, Jan Jeffries, Dwight Douglas, Holland Cook, Jim Glass, Bob McNeil, Daniel Anstag, Sue Wilson. I mean, it's just a who's who of consultants and radio legends. And how are you managing all this? I mean, when you've got 200 radio stations and they're requiring that kind of, time, and they want a piece of, I understand that you've got these great consultants, but your name is on the sign. And I think they would probably all want a little bit of you as well. How did you structure it all, and how did you manage it?
Well, I mean, there were a couple things that were happening then. One was consolidation in the mid-90s. And I didn't want, Charlie and I had AC, country, oldies, and top 40. Some station that we were consulting would buy another station and say to us, "You guys don't do rock, do you?" Or the rock station guys would buy us. And I have somebody saying to me, "Yeah, we're going to have to let you go because we got these other guys. We have Burkhart, Abrams, Douglas, or somebody." And so I just decided I have to have more formats covered because otherwise I've got the fox in the hen house. And it came out to about 20 stations a person could handle before things started falling through the cracks. And so when somebody got maxed, we added another consultant. We built it out that way. The business model was kind of a tiered management model, meaning I would hire someone and pay them a base. They had to do 5 stations without any commission. But then after that, for every station they did, they got a 25% commission on top of their base. And so it just built out that way that.
Very smart model.
Yeah, we have the expense, but they have a benefit. 25% commission is a big number. And so they have a benefit. And, we got married to researchers. We, got tight with TM Studios long ago, Jim Long, those guys when FirstCom and TM merged. And so we could bring a client, not only all the programming, we could bring them services at discounts. And so that was our strategy. That's how we built it out. We had David Rogerson working with us in Australia and New Zealand. David had been a group PD down there. We had Chris Burns, who was a group PD in New Zealand. Chris married to a Canadian girl, moved to Canada. He became our partner in Canada. So it made McVay Media global.
At the peak, how many employees did you have working for you and consultants?
About 25.
It's a big operation. And just handling the travel alone, did you have a full-time travel person?
Yeah, we did. There were travel agents in the old days.
Yeah.
And so I had owned radio stations as well in my life. And a guy named Steve Smith was not the famous Steve Smith that we lost a couple years ago, but a guy named Steve Smith, whose mother owned a travel agent, was my financial guy. He was kind of our guy on the radio side. And so, we hired his mother to do all our travel for our people.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
How much time were you? I mean, you travel a lot today, but how much were you on the road then?
I did 5 days a week, 48 weeks a year.
Oh my gosh.
For most of 20 years. I was 28 years before I went to the next chapter of my career. But the last 20 were 5 days a week.
Unbelievable. You get into station ownership. How did those become available, and what made you decide to buy radio stations?
So the consolidation was happening. Some radio stations initially were selling for the price of a house. There was a local businessman in Cleveland named Barry Gerber who had his eyes on a radio station in Naples, Florida. He needed a radio guy. He came to me. We did it as an LLC. I bought a few units. He had a few units. We went out and raised capital and bought that station. That station we leveraged and bought an AM/FM in Key West. And so I was part of that one company. We sold to, I think it was General Electric and then became Beasley, one of the stations in Naples. We sold the station in Key West to iHeart, then Clear Channel. FM that's called The Whale that's still there. I don't know what they call the AM today. We had an AM and FM in Honolulu and then picked up a second FM. And that was because our bank, Barclays, was having some problems with some people that they had invested in. And so they gave us a great deal to operate those. So Steve Smith, the financial guy I mentioned, He and I operated those. And then we bought Flint, Michigan. Now, my original idea was resort markets. But again, Barclays, the bank, had tried to repossess this station in Flint and found out they couldn't because they're a British bank. And you can't own an FCC license if you're a foreign entity. And so they sold it to us. They came to us and said, how long does it take you to drive from Cleveland to Flint? I was like, I don't know, 3 hours. And so they said, great, we want to sell you this station. And no, I don't want to do that. Chesley Maddox, who owns a very successful radio group and radio network, was then running her own independent investment banking group. And Chesley was representing me in this transaction. And so we bought that station for pennies on the dollar. We sold it to Connoisseur, who later sold it to Cumulus.
What were some of the stresses and the differences? You've been a GM, a PD, you've got a very successful consultancy with over 200 stations, and now you're owning radio stations. How many stations did you have at any given time that you owned?
Not a lot by today's standards. I mean, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 stations.
It's a lot, still a lot going on in markets all across, not only across the country, but one across the Pacific in Hawaii.
Yeah.
How did you deal with all that from just a stress management situation? And then how did you operate it all?
It was stressful, but it was stressful from a financial standpoint, not the operation itself. It was just stressful in Desert Storm happened while that was going on. We had a downturn in the economy. All of those things were challenges, but they all turned out okay. But no real operational stress. I didn't have trouble finding good people. I mean, we did some amazing things. I don't know if you remember the contest, the birthday game, but we did the birthday game in Honolulu on KQMQ. And, you know, for those that don't know that game, you run a ton of TV on Wednesday and Thursday morning, telling people to tune in Thursday morning at 7:20. If your birthday is in the envelope, be the 10th caller and you win $5,000. And so you do that 1 week, 5,000, next week, 5,000. Then you go to 10,000, then 15, then 20, then 25,000. We did that there. You know, we put the money into the TV production. Filmhouse was the TV company, and they were not inexpensive. And we did the promotion and hit #1. It was big. But turning that into revenue was a challenge. And so any stress I felt, Chachi, was just from about the finances.
And what was the hypothesis around resort markets?
You always are going to have the ability for a top 40 or something up tempo because they're going to want to advertise clubs, cars, bars.
I see.
And if you have an AM, news talk, because people in resort markets want to know the weather. They want to know what's happening in that little town they're visiting. And so that's what we went for.
I also want to note during this entire period where you're consulting all the stations and you own stations, you also bought Burkhart Douglas, which was another prominent consultancy. How much did that grow the business by?
You know, it was first off, Kent Burkhart, who just celebrated 90 years.
Amazing.
Kent had built an amazing company. And back in the day, Burkhart Abrams Douglas, Burkhart Abrams Douglas Elliott, that was the premier brand for rock consultancies. Lee Abrams is still a very well-known genius today. If I had it to do over, I would just try to steal the consultants. Because when you buy a personal services business, people were buying Kent, they were buying the other people. And so some of them left when we bought the company. And we were able to convert them. We stayed cash flow positive. McVay Media, knock on wood, has never been negative cash. But, you know, that put a lot of pressure on us for about 2 years when we bought that company. And ultimately, I just absorbed it. Ultimately, we just killed the name and rolled Greg Gillespie and Val Garris into McVay Media.
2011. And thank you for sharing the background earlier. You get a call from, I presume, Lou or John?
John, and actually what happened was I was at the Worldwide Radio Summit. The Cumulus guys had just bought Citadel, and that brought with it the ABC stations that Citadel had purchased, as well as the ABC radio network, which they renamed Citadel Media. And so I see Lou speak. John is there. I go up to John at the end of it. And because I knew the brothers, because their father was someone I'd worked for, I said to him, your mother and father have to be so proud. What you guys are doing is amazing. And John said, can we grab a coffee? And I said, sure. We sit down and he says, let's put the band back together. And I'm like, what do you mean? Now, our firstborn child, Nikki, is pregnant with her first child. I'm considering slowing down. I'm going to push the radio clients off to the various consultants. I want to just have a handful myself. And that's what I want to do. And I explained that to him. I don't want to come run programming. I want to slow down. And he said to me, guys like you die when you slow down. and I kept trying to not consider it seriously. And Lou and John said, look, come to Atlanta next week. Just meet with us. We'll fly you down. We'll put you up. You can always say no. There's that line again, right? Just come see us. And so I tell people when the plane took off out of Los Angeles on that June afternoon, and I was looking out the window, I was saying to myself, what a nice compliment that in the autumn of my career, someone would offer me at that time the chance to be involved with 550 some radio stations. By the time the plane lands 5 hours later, I'm still looking out the window, but now I'm thinking, I wonder what they'll pay me.
So you go to Atlanta, and how do they, are you kind of sold at that point, or do they still need to convince you otherwise?
Still needed to convince me. I mean, it took a little bit of time to get there. It probably took about a month before I was ready to say yes. And at that time, you heard me mention John Pinch's name earlier. Lou Dickey was CEO. John Pinch and John Dickey were co-COOs. And so, I've got multiple friends there. And, the moment of insanity where you say yes.
Does the consultancy's, still really good size consultancy. So at that point, Doris, I know Doris has always had a very large role. Do you guys then make the decision that Doris is going to take over, or how do you set that structure up? Yeah,
they allowed me to keep one radio client. That was Fort Wayne, Circus Tarzan, which I still have today. So today I've had that station since 1984, coming up on like...
You personally?
Yeah, me personally. And so that cluster in Fort Wayne, I've had coming up on 40 years this fall. That they allowed me to keep unless Cumulus bought in the market, then I would have had to drop them. And so Doris still worked. By that time, we had Dave Lang doing rock, Holland Cook News Talk, Jim Glass Sports. And I think Charlie was still doing some country things on the side. Bob Moody was doing some country for us on the side. And so she managed that. I was still working with John Tesh's show, too. That was another carve-out. But McVay Media just downsized, and we have a daily show prep thing. That kept her very busy. And so it enabled me to go off and think about what I'm going to do and learn the job at Cumulus while she kept McVay Media going.
I remember when I first saw you after taking this job, and you said something that I still repeat to this day. You said, it's like drinking from a fire hose.
Truly.
How was this role, being in charge of all the content, all the programming for 500 radio stations, plus the network, different from the consultancy in terms of your day-to-day?
Well, I never worked at a company that owned that many radio stations. I never worked anything that large. And Lou and the two Johns were still really in charge. John Dickey, really controlled programming. So I had a voice, and I was, an advisor and an internal, but it's not like I had to learn every radio station at once. And so what John had me do initially was focus on the Citadel stations that were coming into the company. His words to me were something along the lines of, the Cumulus guys get it. They've been Cumulus. The Citadel guys are coming in. Focus on these. Help us. And so you just run from one fire to another in that job, and the fire has to be over the treetops to get people's attention. I like to tell people I took an anthropological approach to examine this strange tribe for a few months and see what their culture was like. But all the time a fire would break out and you'd be forced into action. So I'm going to say it took a year, to be honest, to really get the lay of the land, to really figure out the job.
From a day-to-day, just kind of walk me through you getting up in the morning. There's only really a handful of people that have had that position. It's like you and, let's say, Tom Pullman, Justin Chase, Greg Strassel. There's a few other people, but that have a role of that size. Not many people have sat in those shoes. So what happened waking up in the morning? And walk me through your day.
Well, by 9 o'clock, your day's exploded. Whatever you planned, it's exploded. And so I used to get up at 6 so I could work out and get ready. At 7 o'clock, I'd shower, change, head to the office, because I wanted to get there about 7:30, never later than 8, because at 8, other people start coming in. But so I viewed my workday as 8 a.m. to 8 p.m., because 8 p.m. Eastern is only 5 p.m. on the West Coast. And the approach I took was to really stay on top of the various VPs of programming. Each format had someone responsible for it. And so those individuals reported up to me. And if you were the VP of country, which Charlie Cook eventually became, then he had his stations he was focused on. His job he had to do around Westwood 1. And I could reach out to him and say, what is happening with the ratings in Dallas? What's going on there? And get the lay of the land from him. I would plan my day, but again, by 9 o'clock, the mountain was coming to Muhammad. and there was something that reprioritized your day.
I was taken back by, I would email you at not uncommonly at 9 o'clock in the evening here in LA. And almost all the time, it would be 1 o'clock your time in Atlanta, you would in the morning, and you would respond. The hours you were working was unbelievable.
Yeah, not everybody takes the approach I do, but I felt that if the stations are on the air, then I'm responsible, and the programmers are responsible, be they corporate or in-house programmers. And so I tried to answer every email that I thought was important right away, but I answered every email always. Some of my predecessors would not respond to their own programmers quickly. And so I just made a promise to the programming team that if you email me or text me, I will get back to you. And if it's at night and I'm in bed, if it's an emergency, call me. If it's not an emergency, you're going to hear from me in the morning. And so that's the approach I took. I probably could have worked less hard and had the same results. That's not lost on me. Not lost on me.
So things are really humming along for you at Cumulus. You're obviously working insane hours, but you're making it work. And then there's a really big shakeup. And I remember being at NAB that year, and we read that all of a sudden John and Lou were gone, basically, and Mary Berner was coming in. What was that like, and how did you adapt to that sudden change in management?
Well, I mean, it was a pretty big shakeup. And so, and Lou and John are people that I'd known since the early days of my career. I consulted their father, who had owned in Wheeling, West Virginia, and who owned in Toledo. And so not a lot of people know there was a Lou Dickey Sr. And as I mentioned, a mentor to me. And so, suddenly Lou and John are not there. And Mary Berner, who was on the board, is the new CEO, and she's not going to have a COO. So it was just, the unknown. What the feeling was is we kind of went from being a family radio company to a Fortune 500 business. Now, that's my perspective. If you talk to the rank and file, they would not have had that same familial feeling that was there. But, both regimes were good to me when I look back on it. I mean, they were both good. And Mary Berner did a lot of good things for me, gave me a lot of responsibility. I like her very much. I still talk to both sides of that spectrum, the Dickies and to Mary Berner. But it was a big change. I mean, we saw programming shift and change. We saw more initially a release of control, meaning the first regime of Cumulus was very top down, and the second regime of Cumulus suddenly lifted all those things and said, look, each market's going to be responsible. And so I always say to people, it was a little bit like rioting in the streets of Beirut, where suddenly people were looting and just doing whatever they wanted to do. And so responsibility then took hold again, and the Office of Programming was created, and there was triple sign-off, because we had market managers who may not have liked a program director for whatever reason, suddenly firing PDs that I thought were good, or making talent changes that I thought should not have been made. And so we had to create a triple sign-off so that the market approved, the EVPs of operation approved, which was, on the management side, Bob Walker, Dave Milner, and they're both now co-presidents since I've left. And then on the programming side, me, representing corporate programming. So it became much more organizationally systemic, but not in a bad way. It brought some guardrails to the creative process.
What would be your advice to talent and management in how to navigate their careers in what can be a very volatile environment? And we're obviously seeing, Odyssey go through a bankruptcy right now and, potential management change. So what would you say to the people, that are working at those local stations on how to navigate those changes and how to ultimately shine and make it into the next iteration of the business?
Well, I think if you start with the most simple thing, it is you're being paid to do a job. And so be a professional, do your job to the very best of your ability. If you're unhappy where you are, don't make up fake names and go on and bash the people on social media or the internet. Find a job where you will be happy. God knows I've seen death in my family since I was 10 years old. Life is too short to be in a situation where you're unhappy. So find some place that makes you happy. But while you're being paid, perform at a high level. You owe that to your employer, but you also owe it to yourself. I have never wanted to be that person that people said I did not do a good job, or that they hired me and I was great at first and then wasn't later. So that would be the first thing, is be a pro at all times, because what's happening right then is going to follow you wherever you will go next. The other thing I would say is things change. In the words of Pee Wee Herman, I'm the boss of me. If you're the boss of you, then be a good employer to yourself and make yourself a lifelong project. I'm a lifelong project. I will be at a conference and someone will come up to me that I worked with 20 years ago, and there may be praise, or they may be unhappy of something that happened in that situation 20 years ago. Things change. Times are different. I'm not who I was 2 years ago, let alone 20 years ago. And so my advice to people in the confusion is to think of Pee Wee Herman. And the other thing is, be a NASCAR driver. They tell NASCAR drivers, if there's a wreck and all they can see is smoke, just go straight through it. Don't change lanes, because the odds are you're going to run into a car that slid. Go through the smoke. Just go through the smoke.
That is terrific advice. I love quoting I've never heard Pee Wee Herman quoted, so thank you for all that. I think it's fantastic. In 2019, you decide that you're going to step away, go back to focusing on McVay Media. You start to work with us, which we absolutely adore and continue to do so to this day. And you keep Cumulus as a client. Tell me a little bit about that and what made you decide to make that decision.
So I've lived in Cleveland since 1982. McVay Media starting in 1984. But what had changed was during the time I was with Cumulus, I had 9 years of living between Atlanta and Cleveland, condo in Atlanta, home here in Cleveland. And the travel back and forth was tough. You know, my daughters having children, I was missing time with grandchildren. Our youngest daughter had a little boy, our first grandson. And so I realized I was missing a lot of things in my life. I also realized that the opportunity to consult was still there for me. You know, those seminal moments in my career, being at Cumulus, having been an SVP of programming, then an EVP of programming and content for both Westwood One and Cumulus, gave me some gravitas that I thought could be valuable to me as a consultant. Things were changing at Cumulus. They'd come out of the bankruptcy, which was very positive. But, you know, sold radio stations in New York, sold a station in Atlanta. I knew we were selling LA. And it just seemed like it was a good time. There was nothing bad, no reason beyond that of me saying, this is a time to make a move. And Brian Phillips, who was my successor, is someone I recommended. Mary asked me to help look for my replacement, did that. Brian and I overlapped physically for about 6 weeks, and then I consulted for a year at a high level after I left. So it couldn't have been better. I mean, that year gave me an opportunity to reignite McVay Media.
And McVay Media Now 2.0 has really become even more of a family affair. Doris continues to run the operation, and now your son-in-law Ryan is involved with the company, and so is your daughter Jay.
Yeah, and our daughter Nikki is too. I mean, Nikki's husband is the only adult that's not part of McVay Media yet. And he's an attorney, and everybody needs an attorney in the family. And so Jimmy, her husband, is really cool. And I'm blessed. My daughter's married the exact right people. And so it becoming a family business to an even greater length was because when I had the big McVay Media V1 and 24 employees, I felt that I would be happier if it was me and 10 clients. And so when I decided to come back to consulting in the summer of 2019, I just said to Doris, it's going to be you and I. We're just going to do this. And along the way, we added our youngest daughter, Jay, who in her own right is an on-air talent. And Jay did social media and is our webmaster at McVay Media. But we found that there were clients who wanted to use her for social media as well. So she does that. And she continues to do VO and help really coloring outside the lines wherever I need someone to help do something. Ryan, Jay's husband, is a producer, audio engineer, content creator himself. And so he worked with the original McVay Media. We syndicated a show out of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and Museum, an overnight show called Moonlight Groove Highway. He oversaw that. We did the Donny Osmond Show, which was a 7 to midnight nightly classic hit show. He oversaw that. So he worked on a number of projects with us over the years. And then he was at Westwood One during the time that I was at Cumulus. He stayed there up until just about, it'll be 2 years this January that he left there and rejoined McVay Media.
Let's talk a little bit about all this board work that you do. It's really impressive. I mean, you're on the Country Radio Broadcasters board. You're also on the Alliance for Women in Media board, and you're part of the radio committee for St. Jude's Children's Hospital and Research Center. You also are, very active with a lot of clients, and you spend, a lot of your time speaking at different Broadcasters Association events and the NAB and so forth. So tell me a little bit about your desire to help those organizations and in what your day looks like now.
I think it's all about giving back, right? I'm not on a board or in any particular part of the Broadcast Foundation of America, but they're an organization I greatly support and volunteer to do things for them whenever I can. It's just easy. I mean, when you look at it, if you have the time and you have the wherewithal to be involved in something, I think it makes us better people. It goes back to when I said, I'm a lifelong project. So when I was at Cumulus, I had never visited the Children's Miracle Network, one of their conferences, or Country Cares for St. Jude. And as part of Cumulus, did that for both of those groups. So when I left Cumulus, I continued to volunteer to do things for St. Jude. And not long ago, they came to me and asked if I would be one of the advisors on the radio committee. And so I'm thrilled to be involved with them. The Alliance for Women in Media is one I was kind of drafted into. And I'm not the first ever man on that board. There was a man on the board when I first went there, and then he left after a few years. Tim Clark, who used to be at Cox and Odyssey, is on the board, the foundation board with me. And so when I say I got drafted, it was I started out being one of their judges because someone asked me to judge Gracie Awards. And that led to someone saying to me, can you help us find performers for the Gracie Awards Gala and the Gracie's Luncheon? And that led to them saying, you should be co-chair of the Gracies. And before I knew it, I was on the Alliance for Women in Media Foundation board. And so being a girl dad, being raised in a female-dominant household, that is something I love. I love that organization. I love being involved with them. And the Country Radio Broadcasters is one that a guy named Ed Salomon, you heard me mention his name early on in this, invited me to be a part of that board. I just love it. I just got reelected for another 3-year term. You get to sit in a room with people that are way smarter than me from radio, digital, and the label side. And so I get as much out of working with these boards as I'm sure I contribute.
Earlier this year, you won an award from the Broadcasters Foundation of America, one of their leadership awards. And later this year, in just a couple months, in November, you are going to get an award from the Library of American Broadcasting Foundation, a Giants of Broadcasting Award, 2 incredibly prestigious awards. And how does it feel to be the recipient these years later, going from literally your first gig at 15 years old in Greensburg to now walking away with some of the most, treasured awards in the industry?
I mean, it's amazing. The Broadcast Foundation of America Award felt fabulous because of what they do for the communities. But I was exposed to the, Library of American Broadcast Foundation through you and Benztown and some projects we did there in helping college students learn podcasting and broadcasting. And so the fact that I see what they do and paying it forward was fabulous. But this award is amazing. I mean, I went online and looked at people who've received the Giants of Broadcasting Award in the past, and it's like Bing Crosby and Walter Cronkite and names that are just amazingly huge. And then I see who's going in this year with me, Al Roker and the actress Christine Baranski and Steve Jones, who had been at ABC for a long time, is now at Skyview, and Stephen A. Smith from ESPN. And I pause and say, do I really deserve to be on the stage with these folks? I mean, I'm that honored to receive this recognition. And it's going to be exciting. My whole family, we bought a table. There's 9 of us. So my wife will be with me, our 2 daughters, their husbands, and their children. And so to have my 3 grandchildren there, 2 granddaughters and a grandson, will in itself be exciting for me. They hear me tell the stories about being friends with Stephen A. Smith or other people like that, but they don't get to meet them. And so this will be a special moment for the family as well.
Well, it is well-deserved, and so happy that they're all going to be there. It's a beautiful event. If you've never been before, it's at Gotham Hall in New York, really close to Herald Square, where Macy's, the flagship Macy's, is located. But the space is just spectacular, and this year's class is amazing. Congratulations. Really happy for you, and so honored that we get to work with you on a daily basis. And I'm sorry it's taken us so long to get to this podcast, but it was worth absolutely worth the wait. It's impossible to surmise your career because it's just so impressive and illustrious in an hour and a half. But I feel like we at least, we got the Cliff Note version of it.
Well, there's more to come. So in another 5 years, we can do this again.
I want to leave you with this one last bonus question. Well, I've got two bonus questions. One is a fun one and one is a serious one. Let's get to the fun one first. Okay. Bonus question number one is your style and your sense of, I would call it swagger. Where did that come from?
I mean, if I showed you an early survey from my days in Wheeling, West Virginia, I was wearing a leisure suit. and it's pretty funny, now, when you look at it, because I thought that was pretty stylish then. But I mean, along the way, I always dressed, when I was in LA, it was Freddie Siegel silk shirts and things like that, right? And so I always kind of tried to dress contemporary, but my inspiration was a guy named Tom Brescia, who I'd mentioned when we spoke about my early days in Cleveland, had been the previous owner of WMGI and BBG, and stayed on consulting for a while. And Tommy always wore the nicest suits. And so I started buying really nice suits. And then I read a book, The Brand U50, and it talked about being a brand. And that's when I started wearing a silk pocket square all the time, because that's part of my brand signature. And so that pocket square is going in and out of style. I always wear it. I don't care where it is, in or out of style. I wear it. And so I would say early 80s is where it started. That's where I started to really get serious about it and buy the nicest clothes.
I love your fashion and absolutely love your brain, but you are absolutely the best dressed man in the business. Chris Forgy and Jason Bailey are close to your number one, but there's no one that does it better than you, and you pull it off, man.
I just want to say, I think Forgy's cranking it up there.
Yeah.
If I'm going to be at the NAB or whatever, the CEO at Saga, I have to stop and look in my closet and get right into Chris at some point.
My last bonus question is your legacy. What do you want to be remembered for?
I would rather be remembered as a good person than a great broadcaster. I hope that when it's all said and done, people will look back on who I was and say, they learned from me, that I gave them the time they needed for whatever it was they needed, and that I never did them any wrong. I know that's an impossibility because of the jobs I've had and the positions I've been in, but it would mean more to me to be remembered as a good person than anything else.
Thanks for listening to Chachi Loves Everybody. If you like the show, we hope you leave us a 5-star rating and tell your friends. Make sure to follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. This has been a Benztown McVay podcast production. Hosted and researched by Dave Chachi Dennis. Executive producer, Darren Silva. Producer and editor, Jake Urbanik. Show coordinator, Estefania Padilla. Marketing and distribution, Suzanne Aksu and Robbie Gessel.